So welcome everybody. My name is Karine Davidson-Taylor. I'm with Royal Botanical Gardens. I'm the education officer here, and I'm going to be your tech host in the background, hopefully. And I'm trying to admit people at the same time. I do want to welcome everybody to this event. It's going to be absolutely wonderful, learning more about jumping worms and how we can help people learn where they are and what we can possibly do about them. I realize that many of you are from other areas of Ontario, the province, and also from Calgary, and hope you take time to acknowledge the traditional territories and land that you are on. I would like to acknowledge and honor the long history of the First Nations and Métis peoples here in the province of Ontario, and offer my respect to the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the treaty holders for the lands that we are doing this broadcast from. These are also the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, of the Huron-Wendat, and of the Anishinaabe. And we are on the historical territories of the historical lands of the Neutral Confederacy. So welcome everybody to this wonderful presentation, as I said, and we're going to be discovering about jumping worms. I also want to make sure that we acknowledge that, you know, this presentation and the work that we're doing, the work that's being done is thanks to a micro grant from the Invasive Species Center, but I also want to acknowledge the other organizations that are supporting it in kind, and that includes the Master Gardeners of Ontario, Royal Botanical Gardens, the Toronto Nature Stewards, and Ontario Invasive Species Awareness Program. Please stay muted. If you can do that, that would be helpful until it's time perhaps to ask a question. Otherwise, we'd really like you to use the chat to ask any questions that you might have. There will be a recording of this put onto Royal Botanical Gardens YouTube channel, and we'll send that out to the partners and they'll be able to distribute it to people, but you'll also get a notification of that later on. If you would like to have the best view, I would suggest you use speaker view. That way you'll get the speaker's full big picture, and that's the most important thing. And also if you want closed captioned, it is activated, so you can just get that going for yourself. Okay. Otherwise, I think that's about all I've got in the way of housekeeping and welcome. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Michael McTavish from the University of Toronto, and he's going to tell us a little bit about those worms. So, Michael, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Karine. I'm going to pull up my slides here, so hopefully that's all coming through okay. Got a thumbs up on that?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. Really excited to be doing this this evening. I'm going to jump in. We're going to sort of jump between myself and another presenter, Brook, a little bit later. Is going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that we can use to record some of these observations. So Karine already addressed this, but it's really important. I want to sort of mention this very quickly again. This kind of work really doesn't happen without the support from quite a few different organizations and institutions. So they've already been listed here, but we really appreciate it. For a community science project like this, it's important really to acknowledge the degree to which this doesn't happen without that. So this whole sort of situation with the jumping worms was brought to us through people being attentive and caring about this kind of stuff. So we really appreciate that. And we appreciate your participation in this program, for being here, and for helping contribute to this going forward. So I don't want to dwell on the background of this too much. I want to jump into some jumping worm identification and some jumping worm reporting. But to provide some quick context to this, this is a part of a broader both North American and global earthworm invasion process. So most of the earthworms that we have in Canada are actually non-native. We did have native earthworms, but these were largely wiped out by the last glaciation. So what we've been seeing ever since has been this very slow, continuous introduction and spread since European colonization, and that's ongoing to the present day. As with so many invasive species, earthworm invasion is very much a human-assisted process. So we really help them get around and access areas that they wouldn't be able to on their own. And this has to do with moving both earthworms and their cocoons in soil through ship ballast, through the horticultural trade, the disposal of bait in remote areas, vehicle treads, and so on. So we're really key to that process. When we talk about jumping worms specifically, this is a relatively new group of non-native earthworms. They're from Asia originally, and they've been found in the US since about the mid-20th century. When we say jumping worms, we're actually referring to a group of about 16 similar species. For our purposes, it works to kind of bundle them together, but it's useful to remember that there are actually multiple species and multiple genera within that as well. They also have a number of different common names, so you may hear them being referred to as jumping worms, but also snake worms or crazy worms or Asian worms or any number of different things, but it's all the same group that we're talking about. This was largely a US problem until fairly recently. So small numbers were found near Windsor in 2014, and then a larger collection of observations, about over 20 sites, showed up in southern Ontario just last summer and fall. So this was 2021. And this project here is primarily a response to some of those original sightings. Jumping worms are very fast growing. They have a number of adaptations that make them very successful at invading new areas, and they have predominantly negative impacts on gardens and natural ecosystems. Most of this comes back to the rapid alteration of the topsoil. So they take that organic matter that would normally accumulate in a forest, for example, and they'll break that down very quickly. This can leach nutrients away, and it exposes the soil, the seedlings, and the roots, ultimately having an array of negative impacts on biodiversity in that system. The bad news is we don't really have any, at least scientifically supported methods for large-scale earthworm control, but we can slow the spread, and there's a very strong argument for doing this. A lot of our ecosystems are already facing multiple stressors from climate change, other invasive species, habitat fragmentation, and jumping worms are just another challenge for them to deal with. So if we can slow down the rate at which they have to sort of absorb that impact, this will ultimately be favorable to their ability to survive that. So some of the ways that we can slow this down is if we're looking at an area where we do have something very, very small, very contained. So this might be jumping worms in a pot of something or jumping worms in a raised bed in a garden. It is possible to eradicate these very small infestations through the process of solarization. So using heat, using plastic to cover an area during hot periods. If you can achieve temperatures in excess of 40 degrees Celsius for, say, at least 3 days, that's usually fairly effective at killing off both the worms and their cocoons, and then that can be safely disposed of. At larger scales, unfortunately, that tends to become impractical. And at that point, we focus more on containment. So we say they're already here, that's unfortunate, but we want to make sure now that it doesn't spread to another area. So whether it's a garden or it's a forest, we're looking at trying to not move material from that infested location to somewhere else. So not sharing plants if possible, certainly not dumping soil or any other green waste from that location, making sure we knock off our shoes before we leave from hiking in an infested area, and so on. So slowing the spread, focusing on containment. Now, the purpose of this webinar this evening is really more to focus, as I said, on identification and reporting. So if you're looking for more background about impacts and management options, I would strongly suggest you check out the Meet the Species page for jumping worms on the Invasive Species Center website. So there's a link there. You can also just search Invasive Species Center jumping worms, and that'll get you where you need to be. So if we summarize, what do we know at this point? Jumping worms were first found in Ontario in 2014 and again in 2021. We know that we're dealing with at least 5 species. We're seeing them in gardens, but also escaping into nearby natural areas. We know they can be damaging to gardens and to forests, and they're likely spreading through the horticultural trade. There's also much more that we don't need to know that we still need to find out. So we're in the very early stages of this invasion, and so we want to know, how widespread is this right now? Is it just a few pockets, or is there already quite a bit on the landscape? How many species are we dealing with? Are there certain habitats where there may be more or less common? And how do they spread to new areas? Addressing a lot of these questions comes down to this concept of early detection and monitoring, which is so important for the early stages of an invasion like this. Being able to know what's there, how much is there, how it's moving around is absolutely essential. One of the challenges is that Canada, Ontario, these are large landscapes and our ability to cover them on our own is quite limited. And that's where we come to the process of community science. So using engagement and enthusiasm and knowledge from within the community to source data for the purposes of monitoring invasive species. And that's been an invaluable tool for the jumping worm story so far. So as I said, the initial observations came to us from members of the gardener community on Ontario. We wouldn't have known that they were here until that was pointed out to us. So that's absolutely essential. It's contributed to our current understanding of how widespread jumping worms are in southern Ontario so far, which you can see depicted on this map here now, but there are also a lot of gaps. So it's important to start trying to fill those in and to build a really robust baseline so that going forward, we can monitor how these populations change over time. And that's where you come in. So we need your help to monitor the invasion of jumping worms in Ontario. Knowing this kind of information about where they are, how common they are, will really help us understand how they spread, the impacts that they have, and help us develop the policy and best practices to try and manage them. So to do that, what we're asking people to engage with here is a 3-step monitoring process. The first step is to learn how to identify jumping worms, and that's what we're going to do here today. Then you go off, ideally, search a local area for jumping worms, and then take what you found and go report that online. And we're going to go through all of these steps here today, so you're well equipped to take care of this whenever you feel like doing that. So we're going to start at the top. And this all has to do with knowing what to look for. What do you look for when you're trying to find jumping worms? And really what this is about putting together a few different clues. What you're going to find first is what we would call habitat alteration. This will kind of point you towards whether or not there may be worms at a site. And then to determine whether that worm is or isn't a jumping worm, you're looking at a combination of behavior and morphology. So what they do and what they look like. So the first thing you're going to see is the habitat that they alter once they're present. So jumping worms convert, as I mentioned, the organic matter, the leaf litter, the breaking down material, and the topsoil into this layer of loose, crumbly cast. So that's worm poop that has a very distinct texture. For jumping worms, we describe it as being very much like these kind of dried coffee grounds that are laid across the surface. So you can see that outlined here in this image. And they'll be in there crawling around in that material. These casts are more often to be found in wet shaded areas, so looking alongside of the trunk of a tree or in the lee of a log tend to be more promising places to look because they like it wet and shadier. These casts also tend to be spread very evenly across large patches of ground. So if we look at this image here, you'll notice there's not a lot of vegetation, it's very sparse, and basically the whole of the forest floor here is covered in that loose cast material. So it's really spread out across the landscape. There are non-jumping earthworms that will form casts at the soil surface, so you need to make sure that you're not looking at the wrong type of worm poop. Fortunately, they are a little bit different. So those non-jumping earthworm casts, if you look on the left, they tend to be clumped into these little sort of piles. They're little raised mounds that we call middens that form on the soil surface. So if you see the outline on those, they're kind of clumped together with discrete spaces between them. Whereas the jumping worm casts are more of an even layer across the entire soil surface, as seen on the right. These cast layers can be very, very thin if there aren't a lot of jumping worms there or if it's early in the season. But if you have high numbers and good conditions, those cast layers can be 10 or more centimeters deep. So here we have a photo. All of that is this jumping worm cast where there would have previously been soil and organic matter, and it's just been converted into this material. So we're going to pull up a video here showing sort of what that material kind of looks like from a textural kind of standpoint. And so what you can see is that if you go in and you start pushing that around with a foot or with your hand, you sort of pick it up, it's completely loose. Right, and if you sort of hold it up, it's a fine particulate that will actually fall through the fingers as well. So very, very distinctive once you see it. It's not always going to be that deep, but it can be. So once you've seen those casts, that's your first clue to look more carefully at an area. From there, you start to look for the actual worms themselves, and there are a number of ways to tell if that's a jumping worm or not. The most reliable trait will be behavior. So the jumping worms themselves are generally found in that loose cast material. Sometimes they go deeper in the soil, but often they'll be pretty close to the surface. And they get their name from the fact that when disturbed, so when you pick them up, when you uncover them, when you're handling them, they'll thrash side to side quite violently in a kind of twitching motion. A lot of worms will, of course, move around if you handle them, but the jumping worm motion is very, very twitchy and very sort of sharp. So you're going to see that here again in a video, this process of uncovering some of that cast material, and you go down a few centimeters and you keep an eye open, and if you find a worm and you pick it up, you'll see some of that thrashing, jumping behavior right there. So we have a few examples of this because it can look different from case to case. So here's another video. You can see one of these worms has already been uncovered. So when you go to pick it up, again, we see some of that thrashing. Sometimes it's so aggressive they'll actually just jump right out of your hand. And then you'll notice in this case, they sort of calm down, right? So an important thing to remember is this twitching, thrashing, jumping is not continuous. So it's usually sort of happens right at the beginning, and then they'll kind of calm down. So if they're not doing it right at that moment, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not a jumping worm at that point. But if you do see it at least once, that's a very good indicator. This is a video that comes to us through some RBG staff, actually, showing just how close to the surface and the amount of density that you can sometimes get at some of these sites. So by just brushing a foot over this area of topsoil, you can uncover 10, 20 worms in a fairly small area. And usually they'll respond to that uncovering with some of that twitching. On the other hand, you can also see much lower activity. So this is another video example here. So clearing away some of the organic matter, again, searching through that cast by hand, you get a really active fellow here. But as you sort of go through, you can see we're uncovering a few more of those worms in that area, but they're not nearly as active in this case, right? Even when they're picked up and sort of moved around. And this can happen when conditions are a little bit drier, or if conditions are warmer, or it's later in the seasons, you can get some more lethargic worms. So that's just something to make sure you're not being thrown off by if they're not always doing that aggressive twitching. Okay. So the other behavior to watch for, it's not as diagnostic, it's a little bit more rare, but some of these species of jumping worms will self-amputate their tail if disturbed. So this is a way to try and throw off predators. If they're handled, they'll sort of basically cut off that end of their tail and that'll just sort of fall off. Not all the species do that, but it's another clue that might point you in the right direction. Once you have the worms themselves, you've seen their habitat, you've seen their behavior, you'll want to look at the worm themselves, and that's where we start looking at morphology. Fortunately, jumping worms do have several distinct physical traits compared to non-jumping worms. We do have 35 species of earthworms in Canada, so they're not all the same, of course, but these are some of the general patterns. So if you look at a compare and contrast of a jumping worm on the left of the screen and European on the right here, the jumping worms tend to have a very smooth, shiny, sort of serpentine body overall. And that's reflected sort of when they're static and also in motion. It tends to be a lot twitchier. Their coloration tends towards more of a gray, sort of gray-brown color, as opposed to the unpigmented or reddy brown that we see on a lot of our other European earthworms. One of the most useful structures is here towards the head, and this is called the clitellum. It's a reproductive structure that they use to form cocoons. On jumping worms, it is this sort of milky white color. So if you look on the right, it's more of an orange-red. It also forms a full ring around the body. So if you were to flip that worm over, you would see that ring run all the way around undisrupted. On a European earthworm, if you flip them over, there's usually a gap in that clitellum. Okay. It also tends to be found very close to the head of the worm on a jumping worm. So it looks much closer forward than it does on a non-jumping worm. It's important to watch, however, because not all jumping worms will have that feature. If they're an adult, we know that because we're seeing that ring-like clitellum structure. If that's absent, that's probably a juvenile earthworm that hasn't matured and developed that feature yet. Physical traits are much less distinct on a juvenile, but their behavior still remains more consistent. So a juvenile jumping worm will still be using some of that twitching, thrashing behavior, which becomes very useful in this case. It's also important to know what to look for at different times of the year. So jumping worms are what we call an annual species. They don't live more than a year. They hatch in the spring, grow, reproduce, and then die by winter. So if you were to go in the wintertime, they may be present, but they're going to be present as cocoons. So they'll be dormant in the soil. These are small spheres, only a couple of millimeters in diameter, very, very difficult to detect. So in the winter, there could be jumping worms, but you're not really going to see anything. So it's not a great time to look. In the spring, they'll hatch out of these cocoons. They'll be present, but they're small and they haven't really altered the soil much yet. So they're present, but it's not very obvious. Into the summer and the fall is kind of the best time to be looking, which is why we're doing this now. They will have matured into adults. They're the most distinct morphologically, and they will have altered their habitat to an extent that is much more obvious as you're walking by. So September, October are kind of the best times to be looking for jumping worms. So don't be surprised if you don't find them in the winter. We wouldn't expect to anyway, even if they were there. So now that we're all experts on how to identify jumping worms and what to look for, we want to move on to the second step of this process, which is where you come in, which is going out and searching a local area for jumping worms. The idea is, as we've seen, we have people represented from all over the province here, which is fantastic. So if people are able to sort of cover different areas, check in, we'll have a good sense over a larger area of where they are and where they aren't. So to step through this process, the idea is essentially to go out and search some sort of local area. And this doesn't mean going particularly far. If you have a backyard garden or a front garden, that would be a fantastic place to check. Or if there's a park or a trail somewhere near you that you're already visiting anyway, that can be a perfect area to do one of these searches for jumping worms. Keep in mind, of course, please don't trespass or disturb any of the natural areas while doing this. At that point, you then sort of put all that jumping worm searching and identification knowledge to use. So at that site, the first thing we want to look for, remember, is to look for casts, sort of along the side of a path, for example. If you see those casts, then you start looking for worms. So just like we saw in some of those videos, the process would be to go up to that pile of casts, start sifting through it by hand up to a depth of, say, maybe 10 centimeters or however far those casts go to, and look for worms in that loose, grainy material. Once you have a worm in hand, you're looking for those clues from their habitat, from their behavior, and from their morphology. Mostly, are they sort of doing that twitching behavior when you pick them up to assess whether this is likely a jumping worm or not. If you do find what you suspect to be a jumping worm, then we get into more of the reporting process of this. What we need from our standpoint to be able to confirm what we're looking at would be photos and videos of the earthworm casts and of the earthworms themselves. And we'll get more into sort of how these different products are used for different parts of the reporting. But you're on site, you take a photo of the casts, take a photo of the earthworm, take a video of the earthworm and some of this thrashing behavior, and that should be plenty for us to go on. We have a very brief 3-question questionnaire about the location where you found these potential jumping worms that we would ask you to fill out and submit with the observation. We'll go through this in a second, but it gives us a lot more details to work on for subsequent work. And then finally, you take those observations and your questionnaire answers, and those will be uploaded to a system called Edmaps, which Brook will be talking about shortly. And then that video, unfortunately, cannot be uploaded to Edmaps. That instead gets emailed directly to me. And my contact information is there. It's in the flyer. It'll be there later in the presentation as well. So the questionnaire is only something that you need to fill out if you found what you think are jumping worms at this site. Basically, this series of questions, you'll add text to a particular box on the Edmaps system, and Brook will be pointing that out in the moment. The few questions that we're asking are essentially, is this the first time that you've seen them at the site? So this is the first time you're logging an observation, but maybe you actually saw something that looked like this 3 years ago and just didn't know what it was. So that would be the place to indicate that. The sort of meaty question here is we're asking questions about where jumping worms, how they might have got to that site. So were there any recent soil amendments at that site, like soil or mulch maybe that got put in? So we're thinking largely gardens at this point, or were plants added to the location? If yes, we're asking for information about the types of amendments or plants, when they were added, and where they were purchased. And very importantly for this, we would ask that you use only general descriptors. So for example, I purchased some azaleas at a big box store or a local nursery or something along these lines. We don't want specific details about places of business because we're not looking to blackball anybody on account of there being jumping worms or not. We just want general information about where these types of materials can come from. And finally, if you've noticed any negative impacts in that area that you think might be tied to the jumping worms, for example, well, I noticed these worms last spring, and ever since then, these bushes haven't been doing particularly well. That would be something to fill in the third question here. And of course, if any of these don't apply in a particular situation, you can just skip them over. You can put as little or as much detail as you feel like putting. Some of these won't apply, for example, if you're in more of a public park that you don't control, and that's completely okay. So just fill out as it makes sense. The survey questionnaire prompts can be found in that original flyer that you got where this webinar was advertised, and they'll be made available again when we put out the recording. If you don't find any jumping worms, and that's honestly what we're hoping is going to happen in most of these cases, the job is even simpler. We still want you to go to Edmaps to upload a negative observation. So you just say, I looked in this place and didn't find anything. It's actually extremely useful to us to know that someone looked in an area and didn't find anything. So you've known what to look for, you've gone and searched for it. Now it comes time to actually report those observations online. And the tool that we're encouraging you to use for this is a system called Edmaps. And I'm going to toss it over to my colleague Brook here to tell you a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Michael. That was fantastic, as Kathy just said in the chat. So I'll get my slides pulled up here. I've only got a few slides, and then what I'm actually going to do, folks, is I'm going to take you through the actual website. So we're going to go through an actual report to show you what it would look like on your end. But to start, my name is Brook Schryer. I am the assistant coordinator with the Invading Species Awareness Program out of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. I've been with the program for about 7 years. And I've always worked in the aquatics side of things. I was recently the aquatic program specialist, so hence the photos on the slide being the Chinese mystery snail, which is an aquatic invertebrate species, as well as the silver carp, which is one of the 4 Asian carp species, some of the species that I work on. As a program, we are out of the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. We are one of the 4 programs out of the OFAH, and our organization is actually the largest nonprofit charitable fish and wildlife conservation organization in Ontario. We have more than 100,000 members, subscribers, and supporters. And this program has actually been around since 1992, when the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry recognized that there was a deficiency in the amount of education and outreach that was getting to Ontario's public related to invasive species. So they partnered with the OFAH back in 1992, and alas, basically 30 years later, we have the Invading Species Awareness Program today. And right now, what we do is really focus on key pathways of introduction and spread of invasive species. We facilitate monitoring and early detection, and we support surveillance, control, and response of a variety of species in the province. So it's really important to note that, not everybody on the line may be as techie as some of us, and may not necessarily want to use eddmaps.org. And that's perfectly acceptable. So what you can do instead is actually call the Invading Species Hotline, which is 1-800-563-7711. It's Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. You will most likely at this time get a voicemail, and you will have to leave a message, but we will get back to you. Just give us some time. We are a relatively small group, and as you can see, we do average about 1,000 phone calls a year, and those phone calls are just inherently higher in the summer months because everybody's out on the landscape and they're seeing plants in their garden or worms in their garden, etc. So this year we've received about 1,100 phone calls. So that's everything basically in the province that people have noticed and want to report and receive assistance with. If they want some assistance on what to do with spongy moth in one of their trees, or with wild parsnip that's in their ditch, they call us and we provide them with resources and ways to deal with those species. The big ones this year were spongy moths. I guess Asian hornets was another one. Even though we don't have them in the province, there are a number of people who have seen it in the news, especially since last year, and have been reporting them. But most of the time it's the non-native European hornet, as well as giant hogweed has been a big culprit this year. But the reason why we're here today is to talk about Edmaps and the reporting tool that you folks can use. If you don't want to give us a call, instead you can do it online via Edmaps. This was launched in 2005 by the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health at the University of Georgia. It's still owned and ran by the University of Georgia, and we have a contract with them to maintain Edmaps for the province of Ontario since April of 2014, and it's been very successful for us. We've been tracking invasive species through that platform ever since. And what's really neat about it is that it does combine data from all sorts of different databases, organizations, and volunteers. So if some of you maybe prefer iNaturalist, for example, we do have a project on iNaturalist. Now, obviously, I won't be speaking about that today, but you can rest assured that if you do upload your reports or reports of any invasive species to iNaturalist, that it will eventually get into Edmaps. There is a delay there, however, so we do encourage you for this species in particular to report via Edmaps. Because what's nice is we are working with Michael to ensure that he is the individual who will be reviewing, or one of the individuals reviewing all the submissions to Edmaps. So it will be hopefully a quicker process via the Edmaps system. So it is an application for iPhone and Android. So if you would, if you want to anyways, you can go and download that application, and it is a way to report. It doesn't quite have the same level of functionality as the website, but it does, provide you at least with that ability to report. And what's nice about it is, you can capture the photo right there with your phone if you see it, and then it'll actually georeference where you are based on where you are with your phone. So you won't actually have to plug in that drop pin, which I'm going to show you, or the lat long. So I'll show you all of that in a second. But just this year, we've had almost 20,000 reports via Edmaps, so it's a very, it's a well-used system. So that being said, I'm going to hop over to hopefully you guys can see that okay. So here's the home page for Edmaps, as you saw in Michael's slides. So if you were to come here, the first thing you're going to do, obviously, is I'm already signed in, but you are going to want to make sure that you are signed in. So you're going to come here, and what you'll see is register or log in. Make sure you register, and not to worry, it doesn't collect a lot of your data or a lot of your information like a lot of websites nowadays. It just wants your name and your email. So when the time comes that your report has been reviewed, or maybe even deleted, or whatever occurs, let's say it's a misidentification, and I'll write you a little note saying that as such, you're going to get an email with that information that you can then subsequently reply to have a conversation with me. So make sure you log in. And then in this circumstance, let's say you're reporting jumping worms. You're going to come here, you're going to go to report sightings, and then you're going to come down here to wildlife. And then as you can see, Edmaps is delivered for a number of jurisdictions all across, in this case, the world, because you have some Hungary and Iceland. But then obviously you see here on the right, all the Canadian provinces, as well as all the US states and territories. So we're going to go to Ontario, because that's where we are. And now, don't be overwhelmed by this page here, because it looks like a lot of information that it's asking for. What you see in red, as you can see right here, are the required fields. So those are the bare minimum that you require to input in order to make a report. Okay. Obviously, we always recommend that you include as much information as you can, but if you're just trying to make a quick report, that's all you need to include. Michael had mentioned the importance of positive and negative data, and here it is. So right off the hop, the very first thing you're going to see here: positive, invasives found; negative, no invasives found. So if you go out and you're monitoring for jumping worms and you don't find them, make sure you click negative, okay? You're going to see that it blocks off some of these drop-down menus. Well, it's because there's nothing there. Now, alternatively, if it's positive, we're going to do that. Next, the easiest way usually is just to type in jumping worms. You see the family there. As Michael had mentioned, there are a number of families and genera, so we've kept it broad, and then Michael is the one who will be looking at that, and hopefully between him and some other folks identifying it maybe more specifically. With that being said, once you're there, it's going to auto populate your observation date, and then it's going to ask you for all these other nifty little things. And the nice thing about this system is it's fairly user friendly. I know it looks intimidating, but if there's anything you don't understand, all you have to do is hover over this little question mark, and it's going to tell you exactly what they're asking for here. So choose the general habitat description that most closely matches that habitat. So this could be, the edge of a field or forest. It could be a garden. It could be a park. There's all sorts of options. And then infested area, survey area. Again, there's going to be all these question marks that are going to tell you what we're asking for. but those aren't required, right? They're not red. So if you don't want to fill those in, totally up to you. But it is, again, beneficial for us to know. Life status is right here, dead, alive, or unknown. Description, adult, juvenile, or unknown. You know, again, there's lots of information here that can be plugged in. Now we get to the tricky part. As I said, if you're using the application on the phone, it's going to auto-populate this for you. But if you're not, what you can do is just like Google Maps, you're going to use your cursor. You can click and drag, right? And then you're going to use this little plus sign here, or maybe control scroll on your mouse to scroll in where you are. You know, we're going to come down here. Oh, we see RBG right there. You're going to zoom in. And what you can actually do is take this little pin feature right here and drop exactly where it is that you found that jumping one. Okay. We want the location of the species, not where you live, because there's a number of people oftentimes will plug this point in where they live. And then I have to email them and ask them for the actual location. Sometimes it is where they live, but a lot of times it's not. You can use other functions like drawing a line, right? There's drawing a polygon. So if it's infesting a large area, you can do it like that. Or again, you can just simply drop a pin marker, okay? Once that's done, once you drop that pin, you can see here that it auto-populates the latitude and longitude. Now, if you don't want to drop the pin and you want to be really specific, let's say you have that latitude and longitude, you can just come over here and actually type it in, and then it'll auto-populate that pin into that map for you, okay? So again, it's fairly, user-friendly. I know that it seems intimidating, but it really isn't once you just play around with it a little bit. So once we have that pin in there, a big thing for you folks to do is to upload photos. Make sure it's, in a JPEG format. I think the easiest way for me is usually just to get that photo onto my desktop. And then from there, you can choose the file and then upload it. As Michael indicated, one of the shortcomings of Edmaps is that it doesn't allow for the uploading of videos. I have, since speaking with Michael, inquired with the University of Georgia about having that adapted for this program. Unfortunately, it's not in the works right now, but it could be in the future. So in the meantime, just make sure that you're emailing those videos to either Michael or myself. If they come to me, I'll most likely just send them off to Michael anyways. So it's probably easier just if they go to Michael in the first place. But no matter, if they come to me, I'm more than happy to facilitate passing them on. Now, he talked about that additional information section, okay? So you see here, actually, if you kind of scroll over that little corner spot right there, you can actually drag that and make that a lot bigger, which I find is useful, especially when you're trying to type in this little box here. So the questions that he asked, you can type in here and say, I first noticed the species last spring, right? And then you can press enter, go down, and then number 2, and then continue with the questions that he asked. So then when you submit that to us, it's going to come to us. And Michael, Bev, I know that you asked a question about one of your reports, and it has been kind of a feeling out process. Jumping worms were a relatively new species that I actually first found out about from a biologist in Minnesota not too long ago, prior to meeting with Michael and then learning more about them in the province. So it has been a slow process, but we're getting there. We're still working out the protocols with the province, because obviously the province, want to know about these types of things, but everything is in the works and everything is moving well. So, now that reports are going to start coming in, Michael's going to be the individual that's going to help us with verifying those reports. And then once they're verified by him, they will be, approved and submitted to the actual Edmaps system. So then people in the general public can then view those. So that being said, when you do submit a report to us, it is not viewable by the general public until we vet it and then, verify it and then release it into Edmaps. So once you've done all that, once you've dropped your pin marker, once you've identified the species and uploaded some photos, you can then type in your additional information here and then submit that report. Okay. I'm not going to do it now, but when you do click submit report, it's going to give you kind of a pop-up that says, thank you for your submission. And, if there's any issues with your report, I will directly contact you and I will ask you for either images, or I might ask you for, if you put the pin in the right place, anything of that nature. So with that being said, again, Edmaps, it can appear to be very overwhelming at first, but it really is a great system once you get to know it. Don't get overwhelmed by it. There's your positive, there's your negative, and then here's all your drop-down menus. Just type in what you're looking for, it'll show up. And then as you get comfortable with reporting, then you can start to investigate other areas like distribution maps. So for all the different species that are tracked in Edmaps, you can look them up. You can even use tools and training. You can even look at your own Edmaps. So all the things that you have submitted, you can actually revisit them if you want to. So let's say you submit a report and you forgot to submit photos with it. You can revisit that report via My Edmaps to upload those photos. So there's all sorts of cool, neat stuff here, even species information if you're just wanting to learn some stuff and look it up. So with that being said, I will switch back over to my presentation and close out with, there's the phone number for the hotline again, 1-800-563-7711. There's my email, brook_Schryer@ofh.org. As a program, we work on all sorts of invasive species stuff. So whether you want signage or resources or just to ask questions about invasive species, please feel free to email the program, info@invadingspecies.com, or again, just give us a call.
Great. Thanks very much, Brooke. I think I learned something about Edmaps there too, so that was very useful. Thank you. So we're going to jump back in here. We're just going to finish out with a few points here. We're sort of nearly done, and then we're going to have a bit of time for questions left over as well. So as a quick review of our process, again, it's our 3 steps, right? Take what we know about identification, search an area, and then report observations online as just described. What we're really sort of asking is ideally if every participant can go and search at least one area that year. That would give us a really sort of nice amount of coverage, and it would be an excellent starting point. If you're really keen on this, you can always search more than one area. There's no limit to this, and observations can be submitted at any time. So later in the fall, next year, anytime that you happen to notice this, Edmaps is available as a tool. You'll have those questionnaire survey questions, so you can fill that out as well at any time that is convenient for you. So a few things to remember here right at the end. Do make sure you do actually get photos of the worms and the casts from your observation. We do need those as a part of the Edmaps process in order to confirm what we're actually looking at. As we said, we can't submit video directly to Edmaps, but it really helps with the ID for these species. So if you're able to get a quick video showing some of that behavior, that can be sent to me directly, and we'll sort of pair that unofficially with your observation to help confirm it. If you do find worms, that's when you want to turn to those extra questionnaire questions to the extent that they are relevant. Those can be filled out on Edmaps, and they are available on that flyer there. I believe they're attached to the Eventbrite page for this. They'll be with the recording video as well. So a number of places that you can find that. And please feel free to share this webinar as well. This will be available as a recording that can be sent out. It can be sent out with the flyer and the survey questions. If you know other people in your network or just folks who might be interested, please feel free to share, as the more the merrier, and just the better coverage and better information we can get from this. We'll be sending out an info sheet with some of these key ID features, the survey questions, and a link to the recording later in the fall as sort of a reminder if you haven't had a chance to do this yet, or for sort of people who weren't able to catch this webinar live. Because you're helping create these data, we also want to make sure you sort of find out at the other end what we actually discovered. So once we get sufficient observations, we'd like to share a summary of some of the general findings from this year, so you can see a piece of what you were able to contribute to here. And depending on the results, do stay tuned for future jumping worm community science monitoring efforts, because the real value in this kind of approach is that you do this year to year to year, and you're able to sort of build and monitor how these populations change over time. So I want to say again, a huge thank you to all of our partner organizations, everyone who's reported on this so far. We literally can't do this kind of work without that. And thank you very much to everyone for being here today, for your interest, for your enthusiasm. And we wish you good hunting in looking for jumping worms. Hopefully we don't find them, but useful to look where we can and be aware of this. So if you have questions that extend past this, or if you have jumping worm videos to submit as a part of your observations, please feel free at any time to email me here. That's my email listed there. And I think we have some time for questions right now as well.
Yes, and I think some of the questions may have already been answered during the actual presentation. So I'm just going up here. And I'm just wondering if there's any one that you perhaps noticed yourself that you wanted to share.
Yeah, sure. There was one that Holly had passed by me, and she asked, has there been any issue of these worms being sold as bait worms?
Mhm.
And Michael, I don't know if you know of anything directly, but I can't speak for certain. What I said to Holly was that I haven't heard anything come from the industry themselves. However, in all likelihood, it could possibly be a vector of spread depending on where those earthworms are being imported from. But that's just a great question. I'm not necessarily willing to say yes or no. All I'm saying is that it's possible. But yeah, I'm not sure if you have anything to add there, Michael.
Yeah, no, I think it's something, as you said, we haven't seen it yet, but it's something to watch out for. That certainly has been a major pathway of dispersal for other non-native earthworms, so something to just keep an eye on, looking out for. There are also some notes, I think, from Anya talking about other sampling methods, and we had a bit of a discussion in the chat about that as well. One of the nice things about jumping worms is, as you saw in some of those videos, because they're so close to the surface and they're in those loose casts, if you just sort of sweep those aside, you can actually see a lot of that activity if there are quite a lot of them. If you want to go really digging even deeper to sample jumping worms and other types of earthworms as well, there is a technique that uses a solution of mustard powder in water. You do 10 grams of mustard powder, just like what you'd find at a bulk barn or something like that. Mix it with water. You pour that over the soil. It acts as a mild skin irritant, and worms will be driven to the surface. We actually use this for research as well to conduct more in-depth sampling. So it's not necessary for jumping worms. A simple brush will kind of do. But if you do really want to kind of get into it, that is an option for more in-depth sampling as well.
Yeah, I'm just looking through these. You answered one from Bev very early on about status is not verified. But that was, I think Brooke, you went through that with her, and that might have been a very specific question for Bev. We've been working on the protocol process, so of receiving and vetting data. So I think it just takes time for that data to come through and get vetted.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And here's a question from Connie. I think, again, it may have been answered. Connie asks, how is it not important to know which big box store is distributing invasive species? They have differing distributors. It isn't blackmailing, it's blackballing, it's education.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, and so we had a bit of discussion about that there too. Part of this is, from a research standpoint, we're not approaching this from the standpoint of enforcement. You can sort of get into some tricky territory there. Of course, knowing actual pathways is very important, and a lot of people are understandably really interested in that. In a perfect world, we're approaching this where people are interested in this and compassionate to what the situation is. So if you're able to identify a potential source of jumping worms or cocoons, say tie it back to a local nursery, I'd say the best thing to do at that point is to approach them directly and sort of, provide some of this information, let them know, because they might not know in the first place. They may not be wanting to contribute to this spread themselves, and they may actually be quite appreciative of that as well. I think at larger scales, this becomes tricky, sort of the impersonality of very large distributors. And the real challenge with this is that we don't have a regulatory framework for it as well. So at that level, there's very little we can actually sort of do. So we manage it on the scale that we can, which tends to be sort of more local community engagement. And just knowing even broadly, is this coming through large distributors? Is this coming through soil? Is it mulch? Is it certain types of mulch, irrespective of which specific store? That still is extremely useful to us. So that's the piece of it that we're trying to focus on right now.
Judy Zinni, she asked the question, and once again, it was answered, I believe, but for others, maybe you didn't see it. If you find jumping worms, how can you safely dispose of them? So Kathy suggested isopropyl alcohol, or seal them in a clear plastic bag and leave them in direct sunlight. So a little solarization. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that? Those suggestions?
I think, as usual, Kathy's covered most of that pretty thoroughly there. We use the alcohol approach ourselves for a sort of more humane sampling method when we're collecting for sort of that kind of purpose. The solarization is useful for especially the soils or materials, because if you're worried about cocoons being in there and you can't find them, that solarization will sort of get them. For the worms themselves, the alcohol tends to be a good way to do that. I would kind of suggest, if you're dealing with something pretty big scale, it's kind of a bit unfortunate, but at that point, there's usually very little that can actually be done. So I think some people find some catharsis in trying to sort of get rid of a few worms, but realistically, that population is probably going to persist without a more systemic control, and we don't have a more systemic control at this point. So from just a pragmatic standpoint, I'd be inclined to honestly sort of leave it at that point, unless you think it is very, very small and very, very early on, in which case I think the alcohol route's a good way to go.
John Thiessen is asking specifically, in what ways are jumping worms detrimental to the typical to the typical home garden?
Right. So yeah, we didn't get into it as much just because we didn't want to focus as much on the ecology here. And I would say in gardens, a lot of that information is still very anecdotal at this point, so we only have 20, 25 sightings on Ontario so far, but a few people are saying, well, there are these worms and sort of things aren't doing as well, and I think they might be related. So it's very much a pattern at this point, not something we've scientifically sort of established. But there are very good reasons to think that a lot of the effects that they have in forest, that churning up of that topsoil, the elimination of the organic matter, sort of creating this really deep, loose cast material that plants have a lot of trouble rooting in, that's very exposed to desiccation. These will be conditions that are harmful to a lot of garden plants, just as they would be sort of in a forest understory. So basically altering the soil in a way that makes it just less suitable as a habitat for certain species. And probably what we'll see over time, and already gardeners are getting a sense of, especially in the US where they've had this for longer, is there are certain species that maybe do better and certain species that have a harder time. So things that are deeper rooted, that can deal with that really loose topsoil, is probably what we're going to see come out as a winner, but time will tell on that one.
A question from Eleonora is, how concerned do we have to be to when we buying worm castings for the garden?
Yeah, so we sort of addressed this a little bit before in some of the other comments. I think for worm castings, I wouldn't worry about it too much at this point. A lot of this is produced in sort of culture conditions where they're working with very specific species. And so the likelihood of another species getting into that kind of production system is pretty uncommon. At the scale that these castings are produced, it's not really people going around with buckets sort of scooping through the forest where they could pick up sort of whatever. It is much more controlled. So I think it would be something to look for. If you bought a bunch of castings and then a bunch of jumping worms showed up, we'd certainly be interested in knowing that. And then that would be something to watch for in the future. But I would flag that as a fairly unlikely sort of low priority concern right now, just because of how it's produced.
Mary Cameron wants to know, will birds such as robins eat these worms?
Hopefully, eventually. Jumping worms seem to be very, very good at avoiding predation. One of the big reasons an invasive species can take off can be a lack of predator control. So things aren't able to eat them, or they haven't figured out how to eat them yet. That thrashing behavior, the self-tail amputation, all these adaptations are designed to throw off predators. And so far, it seems to be fairly effective. That being said, robins and other species are pretty smart. And over time, we'll likely see some adaptation to that as well. Our European earthworms that are popular food items for robins and such, they weren't here at some point in time too. At some point they learned this is a viable food resource. So we're sort of hoping that that will happen eventually, but it's not as common right now, and that's probably part of why they are so successful.
There's a question here from Bev also about, is there any research being done anywhere on controls? And you've talked about solarization, but I'm wondering if she means a sort of much larger range control.
There are. Most of this is happening again in the US where they've had this for a little bit longer. I would say there haven't been any resounding successes so far. So to find a practical control option, you need something that is thorough enough, that can cover a large enough area in a cost-effective way. The big problem is having something that is specific enough. So you could dump a bunch of poison, for example, over your soil that would get rid of the jumping worms really well, but it'll also kill off basically anything else in that soil too. So specificity is a real challenge. One area in which there is maybe some hope would be biological control. So this would be finding some natural enemy or predator or pathogen that's very specific to these species. This is what we actually do in our other work for some invasive plants like Phragmites and garlic mustard. that's something that would come sort of way down the line, as these processes take a very long time to do properly. But that is an avenue of research that I think people will probably be looking at.
And we've sort of covered half of the question that Janet asks about the harmful impacts observed by gardeners. But one thing she was wondering about was, is there a plant condition that we should be looking for? You know, is there anything specifically when we have, you know, for plants that we've got in our garden?
Yeah, it's a good question, and that's effectively why that is kind of our question number 3 in that questionnaire, is because we're curious about that as well. So at this point, we really don't have enough observations to be able to say whether there's something specific really to be looking out for. We'll be checking whether there's a pattern that emerges from some of these observations from people's gardens. Broadly, I would say any kind of sort of stress. You know, if the plant's unhappy for some reason because it's losing a lot of its fine roots, or the soil's drying out faster than it would like it to, that'll sort of manifest as just generally either mortality or wilt or some other kind of stress condition.
Okay. And Poloschuk was asking about what harm these worms do, but I think we've actually talked a lot about that in the presentation and also in the answers to other questions. So I hope, Anne, you've got most of the answers you need from there. Chris asks, many horticultural societies have fundraising plant sales in the early summer. Is this a practice that should be ended?
Yeah, we get this question a lot with this, and it always stresses me out a little bit. It's sort of a tricky one, but I do have my sort of personal feelings on it, and that is broadly, you know, a lot of it comes down to what your community and your organization feel comfortable with this. If it was something that came down to my decision, I would be inclined to say not to suspend any of these activities. Do be careful. Do sort of keep an eye open for materials. You know, if you're in an area that does seem to have a lot of infestation, maybe try not to share plants out of that area, as we kind of discussed earlier. But I don't think we're at a point where we're justified in sort of shutting all these things down. And a lot of this comes down to the inevitability of the jumping worm situation. You know, they're already here. We don't have ways to get rid of them. You know, in 100, 200 years, we're going to have jumping worms everywhere, sort of in a condition where everything has gotten a little bit more used to it. It won't really be thought of as an invasion at that point. So because of that inevitability, I wouldn't stop doing all these sort of really valuable activities like sort of plant sales and castings and this sort of thing. Just because at what point, you know, do you stop doing that? Things are only going to become more common. So, you know, now's not the worst time to do it. Do keep an eye open. There are techniques that can be used to minimize the risk. I think was Kathy or someone else in the comments here had some good points about the timing of when these worms are most active, when cocoons are present. Also, there are options in terms of selling plants as seed or selling bare root, which will minimize the risk of moving worms or cocoons through material. So there are actions that can be taken to mitigate the risk as well. But my general recommendation would be do this cautiously, but you know, I wouldn't shut this all down. Yeah.
I have a question here that was actually, it was a direct message. Someone asks, are they edible? Seriously, are they edible?
I mean, depends how you define edible. You can try and eat a lot of different things. I can't comment on that personally. If anyone has personal experience with this that they'd like to share, please feel free. But no, they look a little bit active and a little meaty for me. But if anyone discovers otherwise, you can let us know.
You'd have to ask the birds.
Yeah. Well, and I think that has come to the end of our just somebody here, Janet was asking Kathy, could you send the update, the date of the update by Dr. Goris via Master Garden? Okay, so it's more of a Master Gardeners of Ontario, but that might be something other people are interested in as well. But as far as I can tell, it looks like we've come to the end of questions that people have asked. I leave the worms for the birds, whatever they may be.
That's a good call, I think.
Yes. So thank you so much. And just a last sort of call for any questions that people might have before we have to go. And people are still making comments about these edible worms. Oh, sorry, Laura, I missed your question. Laura had a question. I just haven't seen it. Laura, I don't know if you can quickly type it again, but I can't see it.
I see it here. If they're
do
in a
you-
particular area, how quickly do they move on their own to an adjacent
you.
area?
So worms themselves tend to move fairly slowly. Actual dispersal, what we would call active dispersal rate. So this is them sort of spreading out as their population grows and they move, basically crawl over the soil into new areas. It varies very much by species. We don't have great data on jumping worms yet. We know from other species, we're looking at something in the neighborhood of say 1 to 10 meters as kind of a very general number on that per year. So not very quickly. As we said sort of right at the beginning, humans are really the agents that move worms and a lot of other invasive species around very, very quickly. So we'll sort of transport them to a brand new area, and that is now a node from which they will spread out much more slowly on their own over sort of decades to hundreds of years. With jumping worms, I think we haven't really looked into this yet, but I think there's a lot of potential for them to be distributed down slopes or through water as well, because those cocoons are in that cast material that is so loose. We're working in the Toronto ravines in areas where you see them up on these really steep slopes. And so I would imagine it's very easy for some of those cocoons to make their way down the hill or into a river and sort of distribute themselves fairly quickly as well.
Great. Okay. So I've had some wonderful comments. People are really eager to share the recording with friends, family, and even get their grandkids out there, which is wonderful. Make it a family event, go worm hunting. And so thank you very much, both Michael and Brooke, for sharing your expertise with us. And hopefully you will get lots of positive, well, no, not too many positive, lots of negative reports.
That's the hope.
So thanks very much, everybody, for joining me. And you will get notification of the recording and survey and those questions very soon. As soon as we're ready, we'll get them out to you. So thanks a lot. Take care, everybody. Have a good evening.